All right, let's just jump right in with something that might flip everything you think you know about Viking warriors and the afterlife. Here it is. Valhalla? It was never a reward. It was an assignment.
Seriously, just think about that for a second. What if you lived in a world with a deadline? And I don't mean some vague, far-off possibility. I mean a known, prophesied, totally inescapable end of the world. For the Norse people, this wasn't some philosophical thought experiment. This was the fundamental truth of their universe. And it shaped everything. How they lived, how they fought, and especially how they died.
And yeah, this apocalypse had a name, Ragnarök. The prophecy was, well, it was terrifyingly specific. It all kicks off with something called Fimbulwinter, a crazy 3-year-long winter that throws the world into chaos. Then, you've got these two giant wolves, Skoll and Hati, who finally catch the sun and the moon, plunging everything into darkness. The world tree, Yggdrasil, shakes so hard it frees monsters like Fenrir, and even a ship made from the fingernails of the dead. Yikes. It all leads to this one final massive battle where pretty much everyone, even the gods, is fated to die. So, with that hanging over your head, this whole idea of a peaceful, eternal reward, it just doesn't really track, does it? I mean, what's the point of a prize if the entire universe is set to implode? The Norse answer was totally different. The afterlife wasn't some prize for living a good life. It was more like a deployment based on dying a good death. It was all about finding a purpose inside that inevitable end.
Now, you've probably heard the pop culture version of Valhalla, right? It's always painted as this amazing Viking heaven, a paradise for the bravest of the brave. That's the image we all know from movies and video games. And look, that image isn't totally wrong, on the surface anyway. The old stories do talk about this huge hall with endless feasts and mead served by Valkyries. But it's that other part, the fighting, that's the real key. We tend to focus on the party, but that raises a huge question. What was it all for? Why would you gather all the best warriors in the universe just to have them beat each other up every single day? And that's where we get to the heart of it. Valhalla wasn't a paradise. It was the divine equivalent of army barracks. It wasn't an eternal reward for what you did in the past. It was a temporary assignment for a battle in the future. This wasn't about kicking back and relaxing. It was about endless, brutal training. The whole point wasn't salvation. It was preparation. Just look at the daily grind here. Every single morning, these chosen warriors, the Einherjar, would get up, put on their armor, and march out to a giant field to kill each other. They'd fight to the death. But then, at the end of the day, a little magic happens, everyone's healed, brought back to life, and they all go back to the Great Hall for a huge feast. And the next day, they do it all over again. This is not a vacation. It's a nonstop, high-stakes training exercise. They were rehearsing for death every single day. So these warriors are called the Einherjar. The name roughly translates to Army of One, or those who fight alone, which really highlights how elite they were. But being elite served one very specific purpose: to be Odin's personal army for that final doomed battle of Ragnarök. They weren't there for their own glory. Nope. They were there for his. And this quote, it just nails it. Getting into Valhalla wasn't some act of divine kindness. Let's be real, it was a strategic move by Odin. You could even call it selfish. He was basically stockpiling the greatest fighters he could find, trying to stack the deck for a game he already knew he was going to lose. The Einherjar weren't honored guests. They were military assets. Okay, so this brings up a pretty big question, right? If dying a heroic death in battle gets you drafted into an army for a war that's already lost, what happened to everybody else? The farmers, the merchants, the kids, the elderly, pretty much everyone who didn't die with an axe in their hand. Well, it turns out the Norse afterlife was a lot more complex than you might think. Valhalla was just one of many destinations. In fact, it wasn't even the only place for warriors. The goddess Freya actually got first dibs, taking half of the slain for her own realm, Folkvangr. If you drowned at sea, you went to the goddess Ran. And for most people, those who died from sickness or old age, what they called a straw death, they went to a place called Hell. Okay, this is super important. We have to be really clear here. Do not confuse the Norse hell with the Christian hell. The names sound similar, and that's just a coincidence of language. Christian hell is all about eternal punishment for your sins. But Norse hell, that was just the default afterlife. Getting there had nothing to do with being good or bad. It was just about how you died. It was supposed to be a bit cold, a bit gloomy, kind of like a shadowy version of life, but it wasn't a place of fire and torture. And its ruler, the goddess Hel, she wasn't some devil figure. She was just the neutral keeper of the dead. So here's the big takeaway. The major choice in the Norse afterlife wasn't really between good and evil, or heaven and hell. The choice was between a death that signed you up for a cosmic war and a death that led to a quiet, if kind of boring, continuation of your existence. It was purpose versus peace, I guess. Which, of course, leads to the next big question. If you're not trying to get into heaven or avoid hell, what's your motivation? What was the moral compass in a world without the promise of eternal salvation?
The answer is a really cool concept called drengskaper. Think of it as the Norse code of honor. It was this whole package of courage, integrity, loyalty, basically being a stand-up person. See, in a world where your soul wasn't getting judged, your reputation was everything. Your good name was the only part of you that was truly immortal. And this whole code of honor existed inside an even bigger idea, weird, or what we'd call fate. The Norse believed everyone's destiny was like a thread woven by these cosmic beings called the Norns, and that destiny was set in stone. You couldn't escape it, not even the gods could. So the only thing you actually had control over wasn't what was going to happen to you, but how you decided to face it.
So the absolute worst thing you could be wasn't a sinner in our sense of the word. It was to be a neithinger, basically a dishonorable person, a nobody. This wasn't about breaking some divine rule. It was about social shame. Being a coward, breaking your word, betraying your people, that's what truly damned you. Not in the afterlife, but right here, in the memory of your community, you'd become an outcast. And we see this in the real world, carved into stone. This inscription from a runestone isn't praising a warrior for how religious he was. It honors him for one simple, powerful thing. He fled not, but kept fighting while he could hold weapon. He didn't run. He faced his fate head on. That was the measure of a good life. When you boil it all down, it comes to this. In a world you know for a fact is doomed, and there's no promise of salvation, your legacy is the only thing that matters. A good name, a reputation for being honorable and brave, that was the only kind of immortality that was worth a damn. So really, you've got two main responses to living with that cosmic deadline. There's the heroic path of acceptance, joining the fight in Valhalla, or there's the quiet path of continuation in hell. But what's key is that both paths start from the same place, a deep, fundamental acceptance that the end is coming. And if you kind of strip away all the gods and monsters for a second, the story of Valhalla is actually this incredible metaphor. It's about how you find meaning when you know the clock is ticking. It's not just about Vikings, it's about the human condition, right? It's about knowing our time here is limited. And this mindset, it actually offers some pretty deep lessons for us. First, immediacy. If the end is coming, you've got to find meaning right here, right now. Second, agency. Knowing your fate isn't an excuse to do nothing, it's a reason to act boldly, because, hey, what have you got to lose? Third is dignity. The one thing you always control is the quality of your own struggle. And finally, legacy. Honor isn't what gets you the reward. Honor is the reward. So that leaves us with a final question to chew on. If you know for certain how it all ends, does that make what you do more meaningful or less? The Norse world seems to scream that it makes it more meaningful. It forces you to find your purpose not in some far-off prize, but in the courage and honor you show in the time you have. It turns every single moment into the battlefield where your legacy is won or lost.